Matt, let's jump right into the Supreme Court and the decisions that they've got in front of them, which we should get some word on in about 60 days or less on the NCAA's limits on compensation for student athletes and whether or not that's in violation of the antitrust laws in the United States. It seems to me when I read it, and it's hard to read some of that stuff, I get it, but the Supreme Court comments that came out about a month ago or so really, I left with the impression that they're hesitant to blow up the NCAA. They're fully aware of their impact, and they haven't weighed in on the NCAA for a long time. So I think they know where they're at, and they seemed hesitant to blow up the NCAA to me. What say you?
Well, I think on one hand, we have to be, I think, conservative with the conclusions we can draw just from oral arguments, because it's not uncommon for justices to, really kind of lay into an argument during oral arguments and end up ruling in a different way, right? It's
Right.
a way to kind of suss out and test the strength of various arguments. But it's pretty clear, I thought, from watching those, that
Mm-hmm.
even the more conservative justices were not terribly impressed with the definition of amateurism as it stands right now. I also would think that you're right, that there's some hesitancy to blow the entire thing up. But the nice thing is about this particular case is I don't think they're obligated to do that, right? The actual Alston case specifically is relatively narrow in that it's the question of whether limits to compensation for athletes for educational components
Mm-hmm.
can be capped at the way that the NCAA is doing it right now, right? Can Alabama buy a laptop for a football player if that football player is studying engineering and they need that laptop for labs? Can they
Mm-hmm.
provide extra money for textbooks or some other things beyond the cost of attendance? And you can say that violates the Sherman Antitrust Act, but that you're not going to immediately throw open and define athletes as employees, which is what I think most athletic directors and conference commissioners are really terrified of. Now that I'm talking to more people after this, I really think that the main national body that's going to define what amateurism means in the future is not going to be the Supreme Court so much as it is Congress, because that's who's going to write a national name, image, and likeness bill that's going to be attached, I believe, at this point, to a greater college athletics reform act that's going to change some of these things. I don't think we're looking at a world where athletes are going to be employees and they're going to have a salary cap like we do the NFL. But how we define amateurism in 1993, I think it's very clear that's not going to be how this system works in 2022.
All right, you touched on, and I'll tell. We'll get to some college football playoff expansion issues in Boise State,
Sure.
specifically. Boise State's involved in this conversation as well, and I'll tell you how you can get a hold of Matt and watch everything and see everything he does for free, actually, on his new website. But the name, image, and likeness conversation, Emmert's just recent comments about the NCAA needing to get something done here, Matt, by the 1st of July, when a lot of other states are going to have their NIL laws hit the books. How do you look at the group of five here, the Boise States, Central Florida, Cincinnati's of the world, and their role in NIL? Because I'll tell you briefly, to contrast wherever you're going here, I see big differences between NFL or NBA cities or Orlando, Cincinnati, and Memphis, and the ability of students there to truly get a lot of attention versus Boise, Fresno, and Wyoming, where there's not a lot of competition for those kids. And if they go big, they become big stars. So I see more money being made in some of those kinds of cities, with the exception of the Trevor Lawrences of the world. So how do you frame NIL and group of five?
Well, I think in large part you're right. And when we're talking about name, image, and likeness, I think it's important for us all to realize there's a couple of different potential markets here, right? The Trevor Lawrences of the world, the people that could command potentially seven-figure endorsement deals from national brands, your Gatorades, your shoe deals. Those really are pretty few and far between, because you need somebody that's not only personally marketable and plays a flagship position and meets ticks the certain Madison Avenue boxes. I think it's unlikely that Boise, and for that matter anybody in the Mountain West, will have very many of those athletes. The biggest single group that I think is going to benefit from this change are going to be women, not necessarily football or men's basketball players. And the biggest reason for this, your most common name, image, and likeness deal is going to have almost nothing to do with your home market. It's going to be about your ability to monetize your social media. because there is an enormous capacity for an athlete to serve as an influencer. So no matter where you play, and no matter how good you are at sports, if you have a 5-figure Instagram or Twitter account, I can guarantee you somebody will pay to have access to that account and to share brands. And so if you are a women's basketball player at Boise State, even if you're the backup center that plays 8 minutes a game, if you're good at Instagram and you want to be a beauty influencer, a fashion influencer, or a lifestyle blogger, you can make a lot of money doing that. So that, I think, is the largest group. And you can do that in Wyoming, and you can do that at Rutgers, and you can do that at Simon Fraser in Canada. The third thing, going back to what you were talking about before, I really do think it's true for your local restaurants, your local car dealerships, your local sporting good places, that it is better to be a big fish in a small pond than it is to be a small fish in a really big area. If you're in a place like Houston, gigantic metropolitan area, lots and lots of potential brands. But I spent a lot of time in Houston, and I know that market decently well. And the Cougars are a great athletic department, and they're maybe the 8th most popular brand in that region. And that might include the Mexican national soccer team, in there as well, to say nothing of the professionals. The example I like to think of is ECU, which is very similar to Boise and very similar to Wyoming, in that you are overwhelmingly the biggest fish. And there might only be 75,000 people in that metropolitan area, but this is the biggest employer. It's the biggest cultural institution. There's pirate flags everywhere. And if the school takes this seriously, I think you can have a compelling argument. One of the things that's fascinating to me about Boise specifically, though, is that nationally, almost every state in this country has at least proposed a state level name, image, and likeness bill. And a big part of that is because lawmakers don't want to be to blame for state U being at a recruiting disadvantage. There's only 4 states, to my knowledge right now, that have an FBS institution that have not at least sponsored this. Indiana is one, and we can expect that because the NCAA is right there and they're lobbying against it. Utah is one. And I think we can infer, if Mitt Romney or the LDS Church is telling people not to do it, then, and listen, like, I'm wearing a BYU shirt, like, these are my people. Like, I think if Salt Lake is saying chill on this, that would have an enormous influence in the state house. Ohio is one, which makes no sense, and Idaho is the other. So if I'm Boise, if I'm in the athletic administration, I'm calling up some lawmakers and saying, listen, I know that you got a bunch of other things to worry about right now, but we should aggressively focus on this, because if the feds don't take care of it and Mark Emmert doesn't take care of it, we are going to be at a disadvantage right now. And we want to be able to go to athletes this summer and say, if you come to Boise this summer, you'll be able to take advantage of this. Because right now they can't.
And their clock's out. I mean, it's almost on zero. So they were distracted with many other issues at that with the very volatile session they had this year. So I think you're dead on. We've talked about it here on the Kingdom of Pod. Same situation. And I think Hawaii was also in there, unless they've recently flipped. They were distracted with COVID.
They started something. I don't know if it's going to actually get passed. There's several states where someone's proposed a bill and it hasn't moved through.
Gotcha.
Where you've seen the most movement speed-wise has been in the Southeast, especially since Florida went first. They said we're starting in July. Everybody else in the SEC said, by God, we can't be at a disadvantage. So I think it's just Missouri and Kentucky that have it at this point.
Extra Points with Matt Brown. You can find him online at extrapointsmb.com. Covers all the off-the-field stuff in college sports, like these issues. I came up with a new slogan, from D3 to Tennessee. Get free subscriptions, and a podcast, which I listen to occasionally, with Brian Fisher from Athlon Sports, where you've covered a lot of these issues, freebies, and then you can get more about the subscriptions. Back to the CFP, which has just been floated because I know college writers need something to work on, Matt, and we're all in that boat on some level. But this has some meat.
There's a very May story.
There's a working group, right? What are they working on? Craig Thompson's involved, but do you see, if we go to 8, a college football playoff, that the group of 5's in line for an automatic bid? And if so, why would the Power 5 do that?
Well, honestly, I think I'd be a little bit surprised if there's an expansion and there isn't some kind of mechanism for a group of 5 bid to be included in that. And there's 2 reasons. One is you want to head off an antitrust challenge. And this was something that actually the BCS had to at least be a little bit aware of, because if you're a lawmaker in Idaho or Utah or Florida and your main institution gets locked out, one way to win some political points back home is to rattle your sabers about suing. This is what Orrin Hatch used to do at Utah
Exactly.
when the
Did
Utes,
well.
yeah, and the Utes were locked out, and eventually people started to listen. There's also this idea here that even though the Power Five conferences have a lot of legislative autonomy within the NCAA, they don't have a majority on a lot of other issues. And if there's an interest in keeping this entire band together, which there may not necessarily be, because there's very, very different kind of schools in Division One. If you want to have any modicum of unity, you need to be able to throw some kind of bone to these other institutions. And quite frankly, if I'm ESPN, I would encourage that too, because Boise in the national championship game might not necessarily be a ratings bonanza, but a Boise or a Cincinnati or BYU or a Houston in opening game creates a compelling underdog story that right now doesn't exist in this 4-team format, and you can sell that. It's something that I think everybody would benefit from.
Do you think that if they do end up adding the group of five as a mandatory seat at the table in an expanded CFP, there'll be performance clauses like we had with the BCS, and the committee will stay together, and if you're in the top 8, because Carl Benson, the former commissioner, said ESPN would probably pay less for something other than the top 8 teams in the country, period. And if they start getting involved with this other stuff, that's where these committees, I think, are buffers. So what's your take there?
I would be a little bit surprised if there was some kind of like back end legislation that would we have an auto bid unless nobody's in the top 16, because the more exceptions you have, the easier it's going to be for the committee, which is dominated by voices right now that are most familiar with Power 5 institutions, to find an excuse to leave one of those teams out. And we found here, I think, with other national postseason tournaments and other sports, that you don't get the quote unquote top 16 or top 64 teams for basketball or baseball because you have some of these automatic bids. But that provides a compelling television and narrative and media, and also, holistic unified event. College basketball is improved by the fact that we have somebody from the America East instead of the 11th place team in the ACC, even if, Wake Forest is like technically better than UMBC or Maine that year. And for football, it's different because you can't play that many games, and there might even be like a health and safety situation. But
Sure,
it's hard to argue that Coastal or Cincinnati or whoever the best team is that year isn't more talented or deserving of being in a conversation of 8. We've already had plenty of bowl games that have proven that if they don't win, they've always been competitive. We haven't had a G5 team get blown out in a BCS caliber game since like the Sugar Bowl with Georgia and Hawaii 11 years ago. So that it would surprise me if there was a mechanism to keep those out.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see how this shakes out. And one guy that's really most interested is Mike Oresco from the AAC, who I thought at one time had a strategy that said, let's break up the Mountain West with a couple of the top teams, expand into the AAC. And I want to get back to these Power 5 guys saying we need the mandatory spot as the P6, and we'll represent the G5. Forget the rest of them. I'll even cut you a deal. Maybe we'll take less money. What's your take on where he's at now?
The thing about Commissioner Thompson that I appreciate much, even if this isn't actually best for him, he is not afraid to think outside the box.
You mean Oresco?
He's not afraid. I want to say both of them, both Oresco and Thompson. They're not afraid to think outside the box, and both of them are not afraid to talk to the press about what they're thinking outside the box, even if that ends up maybe hurting both of them. Right? They're both happy to talk to people. I don't know if either of those leagues have a ton of leverage to demand one thing or another versus separating from the rest of the group of 5. Like, I understand that Oresco has to kind of beat the pulpit here about we're a P6 and we deserve parity. And there's just nothing about that that's true. Financially, it's not true. Resource-wise, fan support, it's not true. I know that it was very important to him and some top people in the American to make sure that their television deal had $1 billion in it, because to help that perception, even if I think that TV deal is going to really hurt that league towards the latter end of this decade. I think they really sold low on what they have to offer. So listen, if they want to talk to Boise, they should. That makes their product better. If they want to wheel and deal, and there's no harm in shooting your shot and asking. but I don't know if they're in a position to really demand anything special for their particular league. Not just because they don't deserve it, they just don't have the leverage. The system's tilted against them.
Yeah, and I don't see Boise doing that right now for many different reasons. So I think his case is going to be very difficult to get done. But I, like you, really admire him for leading the way. Let's pivot here to the NFL draft, which was concluded, and talk about interest of football in the West, something that is concerning the Pac-12 and the CFP. But looking at the Mountain West, Matt, they had 3 guys taken overall. Whether or not 2 of them came from Boise or not is not the point here. Yeah. But the Pac-12 lagging way behind the SEC, like everybody, and even the Big Ten, and even the ACC. And this drain of defensive linemen, and they say maybe even offensive linemen, away from the West and to those other conferences. And maybe it's starting to show up at the Group of 5 with the Mountain West Conference, and how this may play out interest-wise for fans who aren't seeing as high a quality of product as maybe they can, because the attendance is dwindling for a lot of reasons.
Oh, yeah, all over the country.
I don't know if you see this drain on talent in the West the same way.
Well, for one, I would caution any Mountain West fan to not freak too much about the NFL draft this year, in large part because so many draft eligible players across the G5 decided to come back to school. Mm-hmm. And players that I think in another year probably would have been drafted just decided to come back. It's not like the Mountain West had a really meaningful and fulfilling regular season last year. Right. I would expect that performance to improve by a lot for the 2022 NFL draft. Now, about waning interest, I think here it's helpful to maybe not think about the West as a monolithic unit, right? Because there are some parts of the West that are growing significantly. The Las Vegas area, the Reno area, the Boise area, as I understand it, sure, has blown up several markets within Utah. And then you have places like Seattle and San Francisco and certainly Los Angeles, where people are leaving, particularly those who can't afford to pay $900,000 for a house. And this matters. This isn't just like idle census talk here. This matters a lot from a football perspective, because it's these families of 5 or 6 people that would go through a youth football system and suddenly can't afford to stay in Los Angeles. Well, if they end up moving somewhere out of the Pac-12 footprint, are they as likely to send their kids to a Pac-12 school if they're living in Texas now, or even potentially Arizona? Generally not. We're seeing high school participation rates decrease more significantly, not universally across the West. They're actually going up in Utah, but they're going down in some of these places where it's really hard to afford to send your kids to school. Mm-hmm. So if I was an administrator at Cal, I would be much more worried than if I was somebody in Salt Lake or potentially Tempe, because those demographic distribution changes are going to impact different cities a little bit differently. If I was worried about attendance, I think a much bigger concern is about kickoff times and television and the quality of game, rather than how many high 3-star kids are getting into these programs. It is tough to have a 8:00 Mountain kickoff time in Wyoming in October, because one, the weather's going to suck. Yeah. And you have people that have to travel 4 or 5 hours across the state to get to that game. And they can kind of get away with it if it's an earlier kickoff. And it's much harder to do if it's at night. And then what ends up happening is people don't go. And I know that's less of an issue for Boise State, but across the Mountain West and even in the Pac-12,
sure,
that's a problem. And so, if with this new TV deal that the Mountain West is signed, and maybe if Boise ends up leaving, if they change that again, at some point you have to think, is it worth me taking a $600,000 haircut on this television deal to have more control over when I have these games? Because that's a logistically a bigger factor out West than I think it is for most Midwestern or Southern schools, where people are generally not traveling quite as far and in potentially worse weather to get to a game.
All right, Matt, if they liked what you were talking about here, they'll probably like extrapointsmb.com. I know you've made some changes there, but you do cover a lot of schools and conferences that are perhaps not getting as much attention. So give them the pitch and what's happening.
I'd be happy to. So the whole point of this newsletter is to dig really deep into all these other things that I think really shape what you actually see on Saturday and what you see in your college basketball games. It's very much a question of how your athletic department gets money, how they spend that money, how they fit in with the rest of their school, and how your conference handles the challenges in this industry. And Lord knows there's enough people writing about Alabama and Ohio State. So
Sure.
this newsletter, while it talks about those schools, is also really going to focus on what's happening at the Big West and the WAC and the Mountain West and the ASUN and Division III for that matter.
Right.
You can subscribe for free at extrapointsmb.com, and you'll get 2 newsletters and a podcast in your inbox every week. And you can subscribe as a paid subscriber and get 4, which includes original reporting and original analysis and commentary about what's happening. I know, like my paid subscribers earlier this week, they got a story that broke down how much schools actually make from participating in EA Sports college football, and how EA determines how they're going to pay those schools. And why San Diego State is really upset by what that formula looks like. And that I think would be similar for other schools here in the West. You can find that at extrapointsmb.com.